Cuba's #1 export isn't sugar or cigars, like most people assume. It's doctors. By various estimates, tens of thousands of Cuban medical workers are working abroad at any given time under state contracts, and revenue from exporting medical services has, for years, exceeded tourism revenue and remained one of the biggest sources of foreign currency for the Cuban budget. And here's the paradox that pretty much the entire popular image of this country seems to be built around. A state that trains some of the most sought-after doctors in the world is, at the same time,
A place where an ordinary Cuban can sometimes struggle to buy a simple painkiller at the pharmacy.
Cuba is a country some describe as an island of social justice, where education and healthcare are free for everyone, and others describe as one of the last dictatorships in the Western Hemisphere, where much of what the rest of the world has long considered normal is still banned. Both pictures are partly true, and both are wildly incomplete. The doctor export program itself, by the way, is far more complicated than a simple employment contract. A significant share of the salary paid by the host country is, according to a number of former mission participants and human rights organizations, withheld by the Cuban state itself, leaving doctors with only part of what they earn. Something that's, in recent years, become the subject of lawsuits and accusations of forced labor from some governments and international organizations. Accusations Havana consistently rejects, insisting the medics' participation is voluntary, and pointing out that, for many Cuban doctors, a foreign mission remains one of the few real ways to earn significantly more than their state salary at home allows. Today, we're breaking down 30 myths about Cuba, from Christopher Columbus to the 2021 protests, from Che Guevara to the old American cars on the streets of Havana. Let's get started. Myth number 1. Before the Spanish arrived, Cuba was practically an uninhabited island with no developed civilization. By the time Christopher Columbus's expedition arrived in 1492, the island was populated by indigenous peoples, chiefly the Taino, who had developed agriculture, ceramic production, and a complex social organization with cacique chiefs leading individual territories. Spanish colonization, which began in the early 16th century, turned into a demographic catastrophe for the island's native population, a combination of imported European diseases the local population had no immunity to. Forced labor under the encomienda system and direct violence led to the near-total disappearance of the island's indigenous population within the first century of colonization alone. A process similarly devastating to what happened on most other Caribbean islands during the same period. It was precisely this demographic void, left by the destruction of the native population, that later became one of the reasons for the mass importation of African slaves to Cuban plantations, meaning the island's later ethnic makeup, which shaped modern Cuban culture, was largely a direct consequence of this early colonial catastrophe, not some original demographic given. The first large shipments of African slaves began arriving on the island as early as the 16th century, and by the time the sugar plantation economy peaked in the 19th century, the slave trade had reached such a scale that Cuba was one of the last countries in the Western Hemisphere to officially abolish slavery. Not until 1886, decades later than most neighboring countries in the region, which left an especially deep and lasting mark on the island's ethnic makeup and social structure, still felt today. Myth number 2. Cuba, before the 1959 revolution, was a poor, backward colony with no developed economy of any kind. The reality, on the eve of the revolution, was far more complicated. By certain mid-20th century economic metrics, including per capita income and the prevalence of radios and televisions, Cuba ranked among the most developed countries in Latin America, and Havana was considered one of the region's most cosmopolitan, lively cities, drawing a significant flow of American tourists, investment, and organized crime all at once. That said, this relatively favorable statistical picture masked colossal social inequality. A large share of the country's wealth was concentrated in the hands of a narrow urban elite and foreign, chiefly American, companies, which controlled a significant share of the sugar industry, while the rural population, especially in the east of the island, lived in deep poverty, with limited access to education and health care. It was exactly this combination of overall national prosperity with deep internal inequality that created the social ground on which the revolution later grew.
The myth of universal pre-revolutionary poverty in Cuba is just as inaccurate as the opposite myth of a country that was unambiguously prosperous with no social problems at all. Havana of that period was also known as one of the biggest centers of gambling and organized crime in the Western Hemisphere, where American mob organizations openly invested money, including the famous Meyer Lansky, who turned the Cuban capital into a kind of Las Vegas for American audiences seeking entertainment unavailable back home. A detail that later played no small role in the revolutionary government's rhetoric, presenting Batista's overthrow not just as a social, but as a moral cleansing of the country from foreign criminal influence. Myth number 3. The Cuban Revolution was, from the very start, a communist uprising aiming to build a Soviet-style socialist state. The insurgent campaign itself stretched over nearly 6 years. Its beginning is traditionally dated to the failed assault on the Moncada barracks in 1953, for which Fidel Castro and his comrades were sentenced to prison. And after amnesty and subsequent exile to Mexico, they landed on the Cuban coast in 1956 aboard a small yacht called the Granma, a name that later gave the country's main state newspaper its title, with a force of just a few dozen men, most of whom died or were captured almost immediately after landing, forcing the survivors, including Castro and Che Guevara himself, to retreat into the Sierra Maestra Mountains and wage guerrilla war from there for the next 2 years. The insurgent movement, led by Fidel Castro and which overthrew Fulgencio Batista's dictatorship in 1959, brought together, at first, a broad and ideologically diverse coalition: liberals, nationalists, members of the middle class, and only a relatively small communist component. And Fidel Castro himself, in the first months after taking power, publicly denied any communist intentions for the new government, seeking to secure international recognition, including from the United States. The clear turn toward the socialist model and rapprochement with the Soviet Union happened gradually over the first 1.5 to 2 years after the revolution, largely amid rapidly deteriorating relations with Washington, including economic sanctions and mounting pressure. Meaning the communist character of the Cuban state took shape not as an original plan, but as the result of a complicated, largely reactive process of radicalization amid external pressure and internal political struggle to consolidate power. One of the key turning points was the large-scale nationalization of American property on the island in the summer of 1960, a retaliatory measure after Washington refused to let Soviet oil be refined at American-controlled refineries located in Cuba. A decision that set off a chain reaction of mutual sanctions and nationalizations, which, within just a few months, led to the near-total severing of economic ties between the two countries, and finally cemented the Cuban economy's shift toward the Soviet trade orbit. The official proclamation of the revolution's socialist character came from Fidel Castro himself only in April 1961, literally on the eve of the Bay of Pigs landing, which we'll get to a bit later. Meaning, even this symbolic moment of ideological self-definition by Cuban leadership turned out to be closely intertwined with military escalation, rather than a calm, pre-announced program decision. Myth number 4. Che Guevara was Cuban, one of the island's native-born leaders and symbols. Ernesto Guevara, known to the whole world by his nickname Che, was born in Argentina in 1928 to a middle-class family, trained as a doctor in Buenos Aires, and joined the Cuban revolutionaries while in Mexico, where he met the Castro brothers in the mid-1950s while preparing for the Cuba landing. Despite his Argentine origin, Guevara became one of the key figures of the revolutionary government,
holding the posts of Minister of Industry and President of Cuba's National Bank.
And after splitting with Fidel Castro in the mid-1960s over disagreements about future strategy, he continued his own revolutionary activity outside Cuba, first in the Congo, then in Bolivia, where he was captured and executed by the Bolivian army with American advisors' support in 1967. His image, reproduced on T-shirts and posters around the world thanks to the famous photograph by Cuban photographer Alberto Corda, long ago became a global symbol of rebellion, detached from the far more complicated and contradictory real biography of a man whose role in Cuban history remains genuinely real and significant, regardless of his Argentine origin. Also telling is the story behind the famous photograph Guerrillero Heroico, taken by Corda in 1960 during the funeral for victims of an explosion aboard a French ship in Havana's harbor. The photo itself sat practically unnoticed for several years before Italian publisher Giangiacomo Feltrinelli reproduced it by the millions worldwide after Guevara's death, turning a chance, originally unpublished shot into one of the most reproduced photographic images of the 20th century, while Corda himself, by his family's accounts, never received any significant compensation for the commercial use of his work over the following decades. We've covered the roots of the revolution. Now, let's move to the subject that perhaps concentrates the most myths from both sides of the ideological spectrum at once: the real achievements and real problems of the social system built after the revolution. Myth number 5. Cuban education and healthcare are an ideal social system with no flaws whatsoever, a model to follow without a single shortcoming. Cuba's achievements in these fields were real and recognized by international organizations. The mass literacy campaign of 1961, during which tens of thousands of volunteers, mostly young people, were sent to rural regions to teach the local population to read, known as the Year of Education, and later recognized by UNESCO as one of the model examples of mass illiteracy eradication in world history, really did let the country substantially cut its adult illiteracy rate from over 20% to just a few percent within months. And infant mortality and life expectancy figures in Cuba remained, for decades, among the best in Latin America, comparable to those of significantly wealthier countries. But treating the system as a flawless idol ignores real, well-documented problems. A chronic shortage of modern medical equipment and medications, especially worsened since the Soviet Union's collapse and in subsequent crisis periods, often forces patients and their families to source basic medications themselves through informal channels or with help from relatives abroad. And hospitals and clinics, especially outside Havana, have suffered for years from worn-out infrastructure and shortages of basic supplies, sometimes including painkillers and antiseptics. This gap shows up especially clearly in the family doctor system, once considered one of the Cuban model's biggest points of pride. The program, under which a neighborhood doctor personally knows every family in their assigned area and provides preventive care, really was recognized as a model primary care system by many international experts. But in recent years, amid the mass departure of doctors for foreign contracts discussed at the start, and overall emigration of skilled workers, entire districts of the island, by local residents' accounts, have faced a genuine shortage of neighborhood doctors. A paradoxical situation where exporting medical services is gradually undermining the quality of medical care inside the country itself. Myth number 6, the direct opposite of the previous one. Cuba's free education and healthcare are purely a propaganda myth, and in practice, these systems simply don't work. Reducing the real and fairly serious structural problems of Cuban healthcare and education, which we just discussed, down to a complete denial of any achievements would be just as inaccurate as the opposite idealization. Cuba's system for training doctors remains one of the most intensive in the world by the number of medical workers per capita, and the quality of Cuban doctors' basic training is considered quite high by many international medical organizations, which explains the steady demand for Cuban medics abroad discussed at the start. Cuba's literacy rate, according to international organizations, remains one of the highest in the world, including compared to countries with vastly higher per capita income. The problem with the Cuban system isn't a lack of real achievement, but a chronic, decades-deepening gap between the quality of specialists' training and the quality of the physical, technical infrastructure these specialists have to work with. A gap explained by a combination of factors we'll cover in the next few myths. International medical brigades. Cuba sends abroad, including the famous Henry Reeve program specializing in disaster and epidemic response, regularly receive high marks from host countries. Cuban doctors were among the first on the ground in Africa during the 2014 Ebola outbreak, and in dozens of countries around the world at the height of the coronavirus pandemic, which serves as one of the most convincing practical confirmations of the real quality of basic Cuban medical training, regardless of the state of the material infrastructure within the country itself. By ratio of doctors per 1,000 residents, Cuba has consistently ranked among the world leaders for many years, ahead of most countries in Europe and North America on this metric. Statistics international health organizations consider reliable, and which directly contradict the notion of Cuban medicine as an entirely fictional, purely propagandistic construct, even accounting for all the real problems with the system's material resources. Myth number 7. All of Cuba's economic hardships are caused purely by the American embargo, known in Cuba itself as the blockade, and by no other cause. U.S. economic sanctions against Cuba, introduced in the early 1960s and still in force today, with some easing and tightening at different periods, really do cause real and quite substantial economic damage. Restrictions on trade, banking, and access to international financial institutions seriously complicate the Cuban economy's access to equipment, spare parts, and medication, a significant share of which are made by American companies or their subsidiaries worldwide. Denying the reality and severity of this damage would be dishonest. But many independent economists who study the Cuban economy also point to the significant role of internal structural factors, the inefficiency of the centralized planned system, chronically low labor productivity in the state sector, a lack of sufficient incentives for entrepreneurial initiative for most of post-revolutionary history, and, in particular, the catastrophic consequences of the Soviet Union's collapse in the early 1990s, which deprived Cuba of its main trading partner and subsidized oil supplies. A period known on the island as the Special Period, which turned out perhaps to be a far more devastating trial for the Cuban economy than the blockade itself, which had already been in effect for decades by that point. The scale of the collapse in the early 1990s is hard to overstate. The island's gross domestic product, by various estimates, shrank by a third or more within just a few years. Oil imports fell by multiples, leading to mass, hours-long rolling blackouts across the country, and chronic fuel shortages forced authorities to urgently buy and distribute hundreds of thousands of bicycles from China, which became the main means of transportation for millions of Cubans for several years. An episode the island's older generation still recalls as one of the hardest periods of daily life in the entire post-revolutionary era. Partial relief from the Special Period's consequences came from rapprochement with Venezuela in the 2000s, when President Hugo Chavez arranged shipments of subsidized Venezuelan oil in exchange for those same Cuban medical missions discussed at the start, effectively repeating the Soviet model of discounted energy partnership in exchange for political loyalty. But this lifeline also proved unreliable. Venezuela's own economic collapse in the 2000s sharply cut shipment volumes, once again leaving the Cuban economy without a stable outside source of cheap oil and pushing the island into another round of energy crisis, which spilled over, among other things, into the rolling blackouts already mentioned in connection with the 2021 protests. Myth number 8. Private property and any kind of entrepreneurship are completely banned in Cuba.
State control over the economy really did remain dominant for most of the island's post-revolutionary history, with large-scale nationalization of industry, banks, and major real estate in the first years after the revolution. But there was never a total ban on private property as such. Starting in the early 1990s, amid the Special Period crisis, Cuban authorities began gradually allowing limited forms of private enterprise, known as cuenta propismo, self-employment, which included notably renting rooms to tourists and small private restaurants called paladares. Reforms initiated under Raúl Castro in the 2000s and 10s, and later continued by his successor, significantly expanded the list of permitted private professions and finally legalized creating small and medium-sized private businesses, a step that became one of the most notable departures from the previous economic model in all 6 decades of the post-revolutionary state's existence. The scale and real freedom of this private sector remain seriously limited by state regulation, taxation, and bureaucratic barriers. But the notion of a total absence of private enterprise doesn't reflect the real, if scaled back, economic picture of recent decades. The name paladar, which stuck to private restaurants, comes, by a widely told story, from a Brazilian soap opera extremely popular in Cuba in the early 1990s, in which that was the name of a chain of eateries owned by one of the characters. A fun detail, showing that even the terminology of the new state-permitted private economy emerged largely spontaneously from pop culture rather than by decree from above. Myth number 9. Cuba is a land of complete socialist equality, and there's no such thing as a divide between rich and poor. Official ideology really does proclaim equality as one of its central values, but in practice, a fairly noticeable system of informal social stratification has formed on the island, largely tied to access to foreign currency. For many years, Cuba operated with 2 parallel currencies: the regular Cuban peso, in which the state paid public sector salaries, and the convertible peso, pegged to the dollar and used in the tourism sector, and special currency stores selling goods unavailable for regular pesos. A system officially abolished only in 2021, but the actual currency-based stratification of society, including through access to remittances from relatives abroad and to jobs in the tourism sector, persists today. A Cuban working as a taxi driver for foreign tourists or renting out a room often earns several times more than a doctor or engineer on a state salary, creating a bizarre but very real inversion of the usual status hierarchy, poorly compatible with the notion of universal economic equality. This phenomenon has given rise to its own colloquial term on the island, la lucha, literally the struggle, referring to the whole set of informal, often semi-legal survival and side hustle strategies the vast majority of Cubans resort to, regardless of their official profession. From reselling scarce goods to unofficially offering tourist services. A phenomenon so widespread and socially accepted that it's long since stopped being seen as anything shameful, turning into an unspoken but effectively universal second economy, without which an ordinary Cuban family simply can't make ends meet on the official salary alone. The formal abolition of the dual currency in 2021, contrary to expectations, gave rise to a new version of the same stratification. A significant share of stores with the fullest, best quality selection of goods switched to trading exclusively through special bank cards topped up with foreign currency, known as the MLC system, meaning a formally unified national currency, in practice, once again ended up supplemented by a parallel system of access to goods tied to whether a buyer has foreign currency or remittances from abroad, merely changing the technical form of the very inequality the reform was supposed to eliminate. Myth number 10. The state food rationing system, known as the libreta, fully provides Cuban families with all the food they need. The system of rationed distribution of basic goods by ration card really has existed in Cuba since the early 1960s and guarantees every family a minimum set of subsidized products at symbolic prices, rice, sugar, cooking oil, a bit of meat, and other basics. But the volume and range of products available through this system has, for decades, remained knowingly insufficient for a family's full nutrition over an entire month. By numerous accounts from Cubans themselves and journalists who visited the island, the food guaranteed by ration card usually lasts only the first week or two of the month, forcing families to buy the rest of their food on the unregulated, significantly more expensive free market, or turn to relatives sending remittances from abroad for help. The libreta, in effect, works more as a basic safety net against outright starvation than as a full solution to the food question, the way it's sometimes portrayed in idealized descriptions of the Cuban social model. The range of goods available through the libreta has also shrunk significantly over the decades the system has existed. While in the early Soviet Allied years, the ration card guaranteed a relatively broad set of products, sometimes including chicken, fish, and dairy for children. In recent years, amid a deepening economic crisis, cases where the state physically can't provide even the minimum promised set of goods on schedule have, by local residents and journalists' accounts, become increasingly common, turning the libreta itself into more of a symbol of a guarantee than its actual, reliable fulfillment. We've covered everyday economics. Now, let's move to a subject without which it's impossible to understand modern Cuba: its extremely complicated relationship with its closest and, at the same time, most hostile neighbor. Myth number 11. The 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis was purely a standoff between two superpowers, with Cuba itself playing a passive, secondary role in these events. Deploying Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba really did happen within the framework of a broader Soviet-American strategic logic. But Fidel Castro himself was an active, not passive participant in these negotiations. According to historians who've had access to since declassified archival documents, Cuban leadership was interested in the missile deployment not just as an element of Soviet global strategy, but as a real guarantee of protection against another American invasion following the failed Bay of Pigs landing just a year earlier. What's more, at the height of the crisis, Fidel Castro, in a personal letter to Soviet leadership, effectively called for a preemptive nuclear strike against the United States in the event of an American invasion of the island, a position most historians consider even more radical than that of Soviet leadership itself at the time, which was seriously alarmed by the Cuban side's willingness to escalate all the way to full-scale nuclear war. The crisis's resolution, reached in closed negotiations between Washington and Moscow, was an extremely painful episode for Castro himself. Soviet leadership decided to withdraw the missiles from the island effectively without directly consulting the Cuban side, something the Cuban leader took as humiliating proof of his own secondary status in the eyes of a formal ally. A grudge Castro, by aides accounts, recalled bitterly even decades later, despite Soviet-Cuban relations generally continuing to develop in the years that followed. Cuban leadership's paranoid, but, as it later turned out, largely justified, anxiety over a possible assassination attempt had real grounds. Documents from American intelligence agencies, declassified decades later, confirmed the existence of several dozen plans, developed and, in some cases, partly carried out, to eliminate Fidel Castro under an operation known as Mongoose, including comically absurd schemes like a poisoned cigar or a chemically treated diving suit, which, regardless of their real effectiveness, vividly demonstrates the scale of resources Washington was willing to spend trying to eliminate the Cuban leader over many years of the Cold War. Myth number 12. The 1961 Bay of Pigs landing was a spontaneous, poorly planned adventure with no serious preparation. The operation, organized by the United States Central Intelligence Agency and carried out by forces of Cuban exile counter-revolutionaries, was prepared over several months, including intensive military training for participants in Guatemala with American assistance, and was conceived as a fairly large-scale operation meant to trigger a nationwide uprising against Castro's government
following an initial beachhead. The operation's failure was tied not to a lack of preparation, but to a whole series of miscalculations. Overestimating the local population's readiness for a mass uprising, insufficient direct military support from American armed forces out of a desire to preserve Washington's formal deniability, and effective, swift action by the Cuban army, personally coordinated by Fidel Castro. The operation's failure was a serious political humiliation for the administration of newly elected President John F. Kennedy, and, in the view of many historians, indirectly helped strengthen Castro's position domestically and further pushed him toward the Soviet Union, since it vividly demonstrated the reality of the threat of direct American military intervention. Captured participants in the landing, seized by the Cuban army during the operation, later became the subject of lengthy, quite unusual negotiations. Just over a year after the failed invasion, the United States exchanged the captured fighters for a large shipment of medicine and food valued at tens of millions of dollars. A deal that became one of the first precedents of its kind in Cold War history, and vividly showed that even at the height of an intense military-political standoff, pragmatic agreements between the two sides remained possible. Myth number 13. U.S. immigration policy toward Cubans has always been the same and hasn't changed over the decades. American immigration policy's treatment of Cuban refugees went through several fundamentally different phases. The Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966 long granted practically any Cuban who made it to American territory an expedited path to residency, a privilege not extended to migrants from other Latin American countries, explained by Cold War dynamics and a desire to showcase the appeal of the capitalist alternative to socialist Cuba. The famous wet foot, dry foot policy, in effect from the mid-1990s, distinguished between Cubans who made it onto American soil, who were allowed to stay, and those intercepted at sea, who were returned to Cuba. A compromise measure introduced after the mass migration crisis of 1994, when tens of thousands of Cubans set out across the Florida Strait on homemade rafts. This policy was finally ended by the Obama administration in 2017, in the final days of his presidency, putting Cubans' immigration status on par with citizens of most other countries in the world, and becoming one of the most notable practical consequences of that period's thaw in U.S.-Cuban relations. An even larger, though far less known to the general public, episode in the island's migration history was the exodus through the port of Mariel in 1980, when Fidel Castro unexpectedly announced a temporary opening of the border, allowing anyone who wanted to leave the country by sea. Over 125,000 people left the island within a few months, and Cuban authorities, by historians' accounts, deliberately used the situation to also empty out criminal prisons and psychiatric institutions, which later seriously damaged the reputation of the whole Marielito wave of migrants in American public opinion, and became the plot basis for several Hollywood films of the era. Myth number 14. The case of the boy Elián González in the late 1990s was a simple, clear-cut question of reuniting a child with his father. The story of 5-year-old Elián González, rescued at sea in 1999 after his mother died attempting to cross the Florida Strait on a raft, turned into one of the most heated and emotionally charged international scandals of the decade. The Cuban diaspora in Miami, where the boy ended up with relatives, insisted the child should stay in the United States, while his biological father, who remained in Cuba, backed by the Cuban government, demanded his son's return. The case turned into a massive political and legal battle, including a dramatic armed raid by federal agents who removed the child from his relative's home in Miami, becoming one of the decade's most widely reproduced photographs in the American press. Ultimately, American courts upheld the father's right to be reunited with his son, and Elián was returned to Cuba, where Fidel Castro personally greeted him as a symbol of victory over the Cuban émigré community. An episode that clearly showed just how deeply even a seemingly purely family matter was steeped in decades of accumulated political hostility between Havana and the Cuban diaspora in the United States. Elián González himself
Having grown up in Cuba into an adult man, has since repeatedly publicly supported the Cuban government, including participating in official events, and has even been elected a deputy to the Cuban parliament, meaning a person whose childhood face, in archival photographs from 2 decades ago, became a symbol of the Havana-Miami standoff, grew up to become a firm supporter of exactly the side that insisted on his return. A fairly unexpected, if perhaps quite fitting, ending to the story for many observers. We've covered the foreign policy standoff. Now, let's move to Cuba's own domestic politics, where there's also no shortage of oversimplification from both sides of the ideological spectrum. Myth number 15. No political change whatsoever has happened in Cuba since the 1959 revolution, and power remains absolutely unchanged. Cuba's formally single-party political system really has persisted for more than 6 decades, which makes claims of a total absence of political change only partly misleading. Real changes did happen. In 2008, Fidel Castro, seriously weakened by illness, formally handed the presidency to his younger brother, Raúl, who, in the following years, as already noted, initiated notable economic reforms that expanded the private sector. In 2018, for the first time in 6 decades, the position of head of state was held by someone outside the Castro family, Miguel Diaz-Canel. And in 2021, Raúl Castro also stepped down as first secretary of the ruling Communist Party, formally ending an era of direct leadership of the country by members of the family that started the revolution back in 1959. That said, the political system's fundamental characteristics, one party's monopoly on power, the absence of real electoral competition, and tight control over media remain largely unchanged, which creates a contradictory picture. Formal continuity of leadership, while the basic structure of the state stays the same. The figure of Fidel Castro himself, who died in 2016 at age 90, remains its own separate symbolic subject. Unlike many other leaders of comparable stature, he was cremated with no monumental mausoleum built and no widespread practice of publicly enshrining his own name in place names, something the Cuban government explained as his own personal wish during his lifetime to avoid a personality cult. A decision supporters interpret as a show of modesty, and critics as an attempt to preemptively construct a more convenient image of the state's founder for later generations. Myth number 16. There are no political prisoners in Cuba, and any arrests of dissidents are an exaggeration by Western propaganda. According to numerous international human rights organizations, both based abroad and inside the country itself, Cuba has, for decades, recorded cases of citizens being detained and convicted on political grounds, for publicly criticizing the government, participating in independent journalism projects, or organizing protests. One of the best-known episodes was the so-called Black Spring of 2003, when several dozen independent journalists, librarians, and civil society activists were arrested and sentenced to long prison terms within a matter of days. A wave of repression that triggered widespread international condemnation and seriously complicated Cuba's relations with the European Union for several years afterward. The Cuban government consistently denies the existence of political prisoners as a category on the island, insisting that those convicted are people who violated criminal law or acted in the interests of foreign powers, a position most independent human rights observers who document the specific circumstances of these cases don't share. The word librarian, used in connection with those arrested in 2003, reflects a specific Cuban reality. Amid tight state control over official libraries, a movement of independent, informal home libraries emerged on the island starting in the 1990s, distributing literature absent from state collections, activity the organizers themselves described as cultural and educational, while authorities classified it as subversive, making librarians one of the main targets of that wave of repression alongside journalists. Myth number 17. The mass protests of July 11, 2021 were organized entirely from outside, funded by foreign intelligence services, and didn't reflect any real domestic discontent among the population. The protests, which swept dozens of cities across the island that day, became the largest wave of mass street demonstrations in Cuba in decades, and were triggered by a combination of several factors at once. An extremely severe economic crisis amid the coronavirus pandemic, which hit an already weakened tourism sector hard. Chronic shortages of food and medicine, and rolling blackouts that had become especially frequent during that exact period. The official Cuban position, placing significant responsibility for the protests on a campaign organized from abroad, chiefly from the United States, on social media, does contain a rational kernel. The influence of the Cuban diaspora and social media activity really did play a role in mobilizing and coordinating protesters. But reducing the mass, spontaneous discontent of hundreds of thousands of people who took to the streets simultaneously in different, often far apart cities of the island, purely to outside interference means ignoring the real depth of the internal socio-economic crisis that directly triggered the events. It's also telling that the protests began in the small town of San Antonio de los Baños, near Havana, and only then rapidly spread across the whole country, thanks to mobile internet, which had only become widely available on the island a few years earlier, meaning the sheer speed and geographic spread of the protests would simply have been technically impossible in earlier decades, when coordinating something on this scale without mobile connectivity and social media would have required far longer, more visible, and more easily state-controllable preparation. Myth number 18. After the 2021 protests, Cuban authorities limited themselves to mild, symbolic response measures. The authorities' response to the protests was fairly harsh. Mass detentions took place, numbering, by various human rights organizations' estimates, in the hundreds, and by some counts, more than 1,000 people, including both direct protest participants and, by numerous accounts, random passers-by who happened to be nearby. A significant share of those detained were later sentenced to long prison terms, including cases that drew especially strong international attention. Artists, musicians, and members of the recently formed Patria y Vida movement, named after a line from the protest song of the same name, which became an unofficial anthem of the protests and won a Grammy for Song of the Year, giving this particular cultural episode a level of international resonance rare for domestic political events on the island. The song Patria y Vida, whose title is a direct wordplay inversion of Fidel Castro's famous revolutionary slogan, Patria o Muerte, homeland or death, was recorded jointly by Cuban musicians living both on the island and in exile, including members of the San Isidro movement, a group of artists and activists who'd spent years advocating for creative freedom of expression, which made the song's international recognition via the Grammy not just a cultural, but an openly political gesture, one the Cuban government took extremely badly. One of the figures in the case, rapper Michael Osorbo, one of the song's co-writers and performers, was sentenced by a Cuban court after the group had already received the international award to 9 years in prison on charges of undermining public order and insulting state symbols, something international human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, immediately characterized as politically motivated persecution directly tied to the musician's artistic and public activity, rather than any real criminal offense. Myth number 19. Reports of so-called Havana syndrome, unexplained neurological symptoms among American diplomats in Cuba, were entirely fabricated or caused by mass psychogenic illness with no real physical cause. Starting in 2016, employees of the American and later Canadian embassies in Havana began reporting a series of strange, unexplained symptoms: headaches, dizziness, hearing problems, and cognitive impairment, which led to a sharp reduction in diplomatic staff on the island and became the subject of a years-long investigation by several American agencies at once. There's still no single scientific consensus on the cause of these symptoms. Some researchers pointed to possible directed microwave or acoustic effects, potentially carried out by a third party, while other experts, including a special group brought in by American intelligence, concluded there was no single physical cause and that a combination of stress, pre-existing conditions, and psychogenic factors likely played a role in a share of the documented cases. The Cuban government consistently denies any involvement in what happened and insists it has no technology capable of causing symptoms like this. The question, in other words, remains one of the genuinely few truly unresolved episodes of the island's recent history, rather than a phenomenon conclusively proven one way or the other. A practical consequence of this whole story was a sharp reduction in the American diplomatic presence in Havana, including suspending the issuance of most visas on site, meaning Cubans wanting an American visa for several years afterward had to travel to third countries to get one, creating an additional, quite tangible practical barrier for ordinary island residents with no connection whatsoever to politics or to the disputed nature of the symptoms that caused the embassy staff reduction in the first place. We've covered politics. Now let's move to what's probably best known about Cuba outside the island: its culture, music, and everyday symbols, which have also accumulated no shortage of oversimplification.
Myth number 20.
Cigars were invented in Cuba by Spanish colonizers. Tobacco, and the practice of smoking it, was known to the Caribbean's indigenous population long before the Europeans arrived. Spanish chroniclers, including companions of Columbus himself, described locals smoking rolled tobacco leaves, which became the basis for the later European word cigar. The Spanish colonizers didn't invent, but rather adopted and later commercialized an already existing local practice, establishing large-scale plantation tobacco production on the island, especially in the western region of Pinar del Rio, whose soil and climate conditions are considered by connoisseurs among the best in the world for growing tobacco leaf. Modern Cuban cigar production, nationalized after the revolution and remaining a state monopoly, continues to make products many connoisseurs consider the gold standard of quality, even though, paradoxically, the main market for this product, the American economy itself, has remained formally closed to it for decades due to the embargo, turning Cuban cigars into one of the world's most famous items of smuggling and parallel import. By a widely repeated, though undocumented, legend, President Kennedy himself, while preparing to introduce the embargo against Cuba in 1962, ordered his press secretary, on the eve of signing the decree, to urgently buy up several hundred Cuban cigars for his own personal use. A story that, if true, adds some spice to the whole subsequent half-century history of a ban that turned into a source of constant, carefully concealed pursuit of an illegal but highly desired foreign product for many American tobacco enthusiasts. A similar, if less dramatic, story surrounds Havana Club Rum, one of the most recognizable Cuban export brands. Rights to the brand name on the American market have, for decades, remained the subject of a separate legal dispute between the Cuban state producer and the family of the original pre-revolutionary trademark owners, who emigrated after nationalization, a conflict that means American buyers still can't buy the original Cuban Havana Club today, having to settle instead for a rum of the same name but completely different origin, produced in Puerto Rico by a different company that holds the brand rights specifically within the United States. Myth number 21. The old American cars from the 1950s, still commonly seen on Cuban streets, are lovingly preserved collector's originals, proof of Cubans' loving devotion to automotive classics. The romantic image of perfectly restored vintage cars, endlessly reproduced in tourist photos, hides a far less glamorous reality. The vast majority of these cars have been kept running for decades purely out of economic necessity, not nostalgic love for the era's design, since importing new cars to the island was seriously restricted for decades after the revolution and the subsequent embargo, forcing owners of old cars to keep them running by whatever means available. In practice, this means that beneath these 1950s original bodies, you'll often find Soviet or Japanese-made engines today. Homemade parts fabricated literally by hand by local craftsmen out of whatever materials were on hand, and complex, years-accumulated, improvised technical fixes. Meaning these cars are less preserved historical artifacts than the result of years of forced ingenuity under conditions of chronic shortage, which, admittedly, is itself no less impressive an achievement, just of a different kind than commonly assumed. The profession of mechanic, specializing specifically in old American cars like these, has in Cuba effectively become its own narrowly specialized and highly valued craft tradition, passed down within individual families from generation to generation. The skill of literally recreating unavailable parts from whatever materials are at hand, whether sheet metal, parts from Soviet trucks, or even household appliance components, is valued among locals almost more highly than a formal engineering degree, since it's these skills that directly determine whether a family is left with a working vehicle or not. Myth number 22. Salsa is a purely and exclusively Cuban musical genre. The musical roots of what's called salsa today really do largely trace back to Cuban son, a genre that took shape in the eastern part of the island in the late 19th and early 20th centuries at the intersection of Spanish and African musical traditions, as well as to other Cuban genres like mambo and cha-cha-cha. But the term salsa itself, and the modern form of this musical style as a commercial and cultural phenomenon, actually took shape not in Cuba, but in the Cuban and Puerto Rican diaspora of New York in the 1960s and 70s, largely thanks to the record label Fania Records and a whole generation of musicians of Puerto Rican descent who synthesized Cuban musical roots with elements of jazz and other Latin American traditions, specifically within New York's immigrant community. This question of origin remains to this day the subject of certain, sometimes emotional, disputes between Cuban and Puerto Rican musicologists and music fans, each side right in their own way. The roots are undeniably Cuban, but the genre's final form and the name itself are a product of the diaspora, not the island. Cuba itself, meanwhile, remained relatively isolated for decades from the global rise of salsa as a commercial genre. Local musicians continued developing mainly their own homegrown directions, including timba, a modern, significantly more rhythmically dense and jazz-inflected style that grew from the same roots in the 1980s and 90s, but remains far less known outside the island and Spanish-speaking music circles than the more commercially promoted New York salsa. International interest in more traditional, pre-revolutionary Cuban musical roots underwent an unexpected renaissance thanks to the Buena Vista Social Club album and accompanying documentary of the late 1990s, which brought worldwide fame back to a whole cluster of elderly musicians, by then practically forgotten even in Cuba itself, who'd spent decades playing in relative obscurity. A project initiated by American musician Ry Cooder, who was, paradoxically, able to carry out a large-scale studio recording in Havana specifically thanks to a special cultural exchange exemption to the American embargo. Myth number 23. Baseball came to Cuba relatively recently, alongside Soviet influence after the revolution. Baseball was brought to the island as early as the 19th century, long before the revolution, by Cuban students studying in the United States, and by the end of that same century had become a genuinely national sport, pushing the once popular bullfighting to the sidelines, which was eventually officially banned in the post-revolutionary period. After the revolution, the state made a significant investment in developing amateur sport, including baseball, as a tool of ideological prestige, and the Cuban national team remained, for decades, one of the strongest amateur teams on the planet in international tournaments. That said, Cuba's most talented baseball players systematically ran into a practically insurmountable barrier in the form of a ban on playing professionally abroad, which gave rise to a persistent, still not fully resolved phenomenon of leading Cuban players defecting, risking their own safety for a shot at a contract with an American professional club.
A dramatic side effect of combining genuine sporting talent on the island with political restrictions on its players.
Defections are often organized through third countries with the help of special, often semi-legal agents who help players leave the island by boat or overland routes to neighboring countries, from which they can then legally pursue a contract with a Major League Baseball club, a practice that, by the athletes' and journalists' own accounts, often carries real risk to life and involves extortion of large sums of money by intermediaries who
take advantage of players' desperate desire to escape a system that denies them the chance to earn money proportional to their own talent. Some stars who left the island this way later signed contracts with American clubs worth tens of millions of dollars, sums completely unimaginable on a state Cuban athlete's salary, which vividly illustrates the scale of the economic gap pushing players toward this kind of risk, and also explains why the Cuban Baseball Federation has, in recent years, begun cautiously experimenting with limited, scaled-down permissions for its players to compete abroad legally, without fully severing ties with the national team.
Myth number 24.
Santeria is an insignificant leftover from the past, practiced only by a narrow, marginal segment of the population. Santeria, a syncretic religion that emerged in Cuba from the merger of traditional Yoruba beliefs brought by African slaves with elements of Catholicism, remains a practiced faith for a significant, though hard to precisely count, share of the Cuban population, including many Cubans formerly considered Catholic or atheist, who blend elements of different traditions in everyday life without feeling any contradiction. The post-revolutionary state, for decades, treated Santeria and other Afro-Cuban cults warily, as it did religion in general. But since the 1990s, amid a broader liberalization of attitudes toward religious practice, Santeria has gained far more visible public recognition, including tourist tours specifically aimed at learning about this tradition. Santeria's influence is also visible in Cuban music, with the bata drum rhythms and accompaniment, traditionally used in religious ceremonies, significantly influenced the island's secular musical genre, including the already mentioned son and its later derivative styles. Practitioners of Santeria go through a complex, years-long initiation process, including a period known as Iyawo, during which the initiate must, for an entire year, dress exclusively in white as a sign of spiritual purity, a tradition you can easily observe today right on the streets of Havana and other Cuban cities, where people in white going through this ritual year have long since become a familiar, organic part of the urban landscape, rather than something rare or hidden from outsiders. We're almost at the end of today's conversation. But before we close the topic, it's worth covering a few more myths about how modern Cuba tries to balance the legacy of the past with the demands of the present. Myth number 25. U.S.-Cuban relations under President Barack Obama were fully normalized, and the embargo effectively stopped being enforced. The historic thaw in relations, which began in 2014 with the announcement of restored diplomatic ties and culminated in Obama's personal visit to Havana in 2016, the first visit by a sitting American president to the island in almost 90 years, really was a significant breakthrough. Embassies were reopened, restrictions on travel and remittances for American citizens were eased, and opportunities for trade in certain sectors were expanded. But the embargo itself, as a comprehensive system of economic sanctions enacted by law and requiring an act of Congress, not just a presidential decree, to be fully lifted, formally remained in force throughout this entire period of thaw, and a significant share of the easing achieved under Obama was later reversed by the following administration, which returned Cuba to a stricter sanctions regime, including putting the island back on the American list of state sponsors of terrorism. Meaning, the period of normalization turned out to be far more fragile and reversible than it seemed at the moment of the two leaders' historic handshake in 2016. A fitting contrast was also the fact that Obama's visit to Havana coincided in time with a concert by the iconic British rock band The Rolling Stones,
performing in Cuba for the first time ever in front of a free 100,000-strong audience, an event many journalists of the time described as the final, vivid symbol of the end of the island's era of cultural isolation. Symbolism that turned out to be just as premature as hopes for the irreversibility of the political normalization itself. Myth number 26. The Cuban émigré community is a uniform group, unanimously in favor of a hard line against the Cuban government. The Cuban diaspora, concentrated chiefly in Florida, has evolved significantly since the earliest waves of emigration, which consisted mainly of members of the former economic elite fleeing nationalization right after the revolution. Later waves of emigrants, including the mass exodus through the port of Mariel in 1980 and the 1994 rafter migration crisis, brought a far more socially diverse and, in many cases, less radically anti-government makeup to the diaspora, shaped more by economic than purely political motives for leaving. Public opinion surveys of Cuban Americans in recent decades show a notable generational split. The older, first-wave generation of immigrants and their direct descendants generally maintain a harder anti-government stance and traditionally support keeping the sanctions in place, while younger generations and later waves of immigrants more often favor easing policy and expanding contact with the island, meaning the notion of a single, monolithic political voice for the Cuban diaspora no longer matches a far more diverse reality. Remittances from relatives abroad, regardless of the specific sender's political views, remain one of the most important sources of foreign currency income for the Cuban economy overall, creating a peculiar paradox. A significant share of the diaspora, even while maintaining harsh anti-government rhetoric in public, continues regularly sending financial support to relatives who stayed on the island, thereby objectively helping sustain the very economic system it officially opposes. Myth number 27. The economic reforms under Raúl Castro and his successor Diaz-Canel fundamentally changed the Cuban economic model, bringing it closer to a market economy. The reforms really did expand room for private initiative more than anything undertaken in the previous half-century of the island's post-revolutionary history, including the previously mentioned 2021 currency reform that abolished the dual currency system. But the economy's fundamental structure remains predominantly state-run. Major enterprise, the banking system, foreign trade, and most industry remain under direct state control, and the private sector, for all its expansion, remains limited mainly to services, small retail, and food service, without comparable access to more capital-intensive and strategically significant sectors of the economy. The 2021 currency reform, meant to simplify the economy, in practice came with a sharp spike in inflation and a further decline in living standards for a significant share of the population in the years immediately following it, becoming one of the direct factors that triggered the already mentioned protests that same year. Meaning, the reforms remain real, but partial and contradictory in their immediate social consequences. Another notable innovation of recent years has been officially permitting small and medium-sized private businesses with a legally capped number of employees rather than being banned entirely as before, a measure that, in practice, led to the appearance of the island's first officially registered private manufacturing and import-export companies in decades, though these businesses' access to foreign currency, bank credit, and state procurement remains noticeably less favorable than for state enterprises, seriously limiting their real growth potential. Myth number 28. With the Castro family's exit from formal leadership of the country in 2021, an entire historical era came to an end, and Cuba entered a fundamentally new political reality. The formal transfer of all leadership positions from Raúl Castro to Miguel Diaz-Canel really was the symbolic end of more than 60 years of the country being directly led by members of one family. But the political system's real continuity, including the dominant role of the Communist Party, the persisting structure of the state economy, and the overall ideological direction,
remains far more significant than the narrative of a fundamentally new era suggests. Diaz-Canel, a career party official who steadily climbed the nomenclatura ladder over decades, publicly presents himself as a continuer of the revolution's work, not a reformer seeking a fundamental overhaul of the political system's foundations. In this sense, the change of surname at the top of the state turned out to be a far more radical symbolic than practical political shift. It's also telling that the new constitution, adopted by nationwide referendum in 2019, formally recognized and legally enshrined the existence of private property as a separate, legitimate economic category for the first time in decades. But that same document also retained direct constitutional language establishing the Communist Party's leading role as the country's sole legal political force, which fairly accurately reflects the overall logic of recent years' reforms. Economic liberalization without corresponding political liberalization. That same constitution also, for the first time, limited presidential terms to 2 consecutive 5-year terms, a formal novelty reform supporters presented as a significant step toward institutionalizing the peaceful transfer of power, though critics pointed out that a limit like this only gains real practical meaning if there's genuine political competition for the position itself, which still doesn't exist within Cuba's one-party system. Myth number 29. Cuba is an island completely frozen in time, where nothing has changed in more than 60 years. The visual symbols most widely reproduced in pop culture, the old cars already discussed, the crumbling colonial facades of Havana, the absence of the usual global advertising and brands, really do create a sense of frozen time for an outside observer, especially a tourist spending just a few days on the island in carefully organized tourist zones. But behind this facade is a society that's gone through colossal internal transformation. The mass spread of mobile phones and, since 2018, mobile internet, previously extremely limited and expensive, has fundamentally changed how people communicate, access information, and organize protests, as discussed in connection with the 2021 events. The expanding private sector has changed the employment and income structure for a significant share of the population. And mass emigration in recent years, triggered by the economic crisis, has, by some estimates, taken one of the most significant migration flows relative to population size in modern Latin American history off the island. Itself a dramatic, anything but frozen-in-time phenomenon, radically reshaping the island's demographic makeup right before our eyes. By some independent demographic estimates, as much as 10% of the total population may have left the island since 2022, an emigration rate comparable, in relative intensity, only to the mass exodus of populations from countries experiencing full-scale armed conflict, making the current migration crisis one of the most significant demographic events in the entire post-revolutionary history of the island, far larger in scale than any of the previous migration waves already described. A significant share of this new wave of emigrants, unlike in previous decades, heads not so much directly to Florida as through complex, multi-stage routes. First, a legal flight to Central American countries that don't require a visa for Cuban citizens. Then, an overland journey through several countries all the way to the southern U.S. border. Logistics made possible only by the relatively recent liberalization of exit rules inside Cuba itself, turning Cuban immigration from predominantly maritime into predominantly overland. A fairly significant shift for an island where the image of a rafter fleeing at sea had, for decades, remained the primary visual symbol of migration. And that brings us to the last, 30th myth of today's video. Myth number 30. Cuba is either an unambiguously successful example of social justice or an unambiguously failed experiment, and any attempt to take a middle position is either dishonesty or a lack of political courage. As we've seen throughout today's whole conversation, reality categorically refuses to fit into this convenient binary framing. Cuba is a country that's achieved real
internationally recognized results in education and training medical professionals, and, at the same time, a country where an ordinary person sometimes has to spend months tracking down basic medication. A country with one of the most recognizable and beloved musical and cultural traditions in the entire world. And, at the same time, a country where independent journalism and public dissent remain a risky pursuit. A country that went through a revolution promising to end social inequality and ultimately built its own, just differently structured, form of that same inequality. Neither excusing all the island's problems as purely the result of outside pressure, nor writing off all its real achievements as propaganda, is any more honest a position than simplified black-and-white moralizing from either side of this decades-long ideological argument about the country. Cubans themselves, by numerous accounts from journalists and researchers who've spent time on the island off the tourist track, often treat these kinds of external, polarized debates with a certain weary irony. Everyday life, filled with both real pride in their own culture and no less real frustration with everyday hardship, rarely fits into the neat ideological camps that observers who've never spent hours in line for bread or medicine find so convenient to work with. We've traveled from the island's vanished indigenous peoples to Fidel Castro personally calling for a nuclear strike at the height of the missile crisis. From the literacy campaign to shortages of basic medication. From an embargo that's now been in place for more than 60 years to streets full of half-century-old cars with Soviet engines inside. From a protest song that won a Grammy to hundreds of people convicted for taking part in that same year's protests. None of these stories fits into a short, convenient label. And perhaps the best thing that can be said about Cuba is that for a country whose top export today is doctors, it desperately needs itself exactly the one medicine that's hardest to buy with any currency. An honest, unbiased conversation about its own incredibly complicated history. This video, of course, doesn't claim to put a final period on an argument that hasn't quieted down in more than 60 years, and clearly